It's impossible to talk about the Mafia without mentioning the name Capone. But what if I told you there are several Mafia trials that will change everything? As much as we all know about Al Capone, he was only one of many mobsters to face trial for their crimes. In fact, there were many historic Mafia trials over the years that forever changed organized crime in America. So let's take a look at a few of these Mafia trials that will change everything. But before we do, remember to give us a thumbs up. Also, stick around until the end to learn about the Mafia trial that even the US government tried to cover up. Joe Masiria. The first Mafia trial that really made waves was that of Joe Masiria. Now this case goes back to the 1930s, when the government began to crack down on bootlegging during the Prohibition era. This was especially hard on New York mobsters, who were very successful during this time. And one of those mobsters was Joe Masiria. Masiria was a major player in the illegal alcohol trade in New York City, making him a fortune and cementing him as a powerful boss in the Mafia hierarchy. However, with the government cracking down on bootlegging, it didn't take long for the feds to catch wind of Masaria's criminal enterprise. No. Soon after, they indicted him on tax evasion charges. This was in many ways unprecedented because up until this point, no Mafia boss had ever been convicted on federal charges. Usually the worst they'd have to deal with was a slap on the wrist from local authorities. But times were changing, and this was reflected in the trial. The prosecution of Masiria was led by the notorious gangster prosecutor, Thomas E. Dewey. The case went to trial where Masiria's defense tried to portray him as nothing more than a hard-working businessman. Even his fellow Mafia bosses wrote letters to the judge claiming that Masiria was just an honest entrepreneur. But the evidence against him was too strong, and Masiria was found guilty of tax evasion and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was also ordered to pay $200,000 in fines. While incarcerated, Masiria lost power within the Mafia, and his health deteriorated rapidly. He died from stomach cancer just 3 years into his sentence. Lucky Luciano. Charles Lucky Luciano is one of the most infamous mobsters of all time. While he never faced trial in the United States, he did face trial in Italy. And it was here where he would cement his place in Mafia history. In 1936, Lucky Luciano was arrested in the U.S. on various charges. Then 2 years later, he was convicted of running a prostitution ring and sentenced to 50 to 100 years in prison. However, not long after, he was secretly released from prison and sent to Italy. While the U.S. government claimed that he was going to Italy to live out the rest of his life, the reality was much different. There, Luciano met with high-ranking members of the Italian Mafia and forged a powerful alliance between the two groups. When Luciano returned to the U.S. in 1946, he quickly regained his position of power in the Mafia. And now, with the help of his new Italian allies, he was able to expand the organization's criminal activities to new heights. The government's decision to deport Luciano to Italy rather than imprison him likely saved the Mafia from complete annihilation, but it would later come back to haunt them. Vito Genovese. After Charles Lucky Luciano was deported to Italy, Vito Genovese took over the family that Luciano once ran. And under Genovese's leadership, the family became one of the most powerful in the country. However, as law enforcement continued to crack down on the Mafia, Genovese found himself on the wrong side of the law. In 1957, he was arrested on narcotics trafficking charges. In the following year, he was convicted and sentenced to 15 years in prison. What made this trial significant was the fact that for the first time ever, a Mafia boss was convicted of a crime other than tax evasion or gambling. It showed that the Mafia was not untouchable, and that even their top bosses could be brought to justice. And as it turned out, they were. Soon after Genovese's conviction, the government began to dismantle the Genovese crime family. Many of its members were arrested and convicted, dealing a major blow to the organization. Despite being behind bars, Vito Genovese remained a powerful figure in the Mafia. He continued to run criminal activities from prison, and was even suspected of ordering several murders. However, in 1969, he suffered a fatal heart attack, ending his reign of terror once and for all. The Apalachicola Trial. In 1957, the government arrested 62 suspected Mafia members in the city of Apalachicola, Florida. Among those arrested were some of the most powerful mobsters in the country, including Santo Trafficante Jr., Carlos Marcello, and Sam Giancana. They were charged with a variety of crimes, including extortion, gambling, and narcotics trafficking. But the main purpose of the trial was to weaken the Mafia's leadership structure and dismantle their criminal organization. The prosecution was led by the tough-talking federal prosecutor Robert F. Kennedy. He was determined to bring down the Mafia, and he wasn't afraid to use any means necessary. Kennedy was known for his relentless pursuit of justice and his willingness to take on the most powerful criminals in the country. During the trial, Kennedy called dozens of witnesses to testify against the mobsters. Many of these witnesses were former Mafia members who had turned against their former bosses. They testified to the jury about the inner workings of the Mafia and the crimes that the defendants had committed. Despite the overwhelming evidence against them, the mobsters' lawyers tried to portray their clients as victims of a government conspiracy. They argued that the government had coerced the witnesses into testifying and that there was no real evidence of their clients' guilt. However, the jury saw through the defense's lies and convicted all but 2 of the defendants. The convictions sent shockwaves throughout the Mafia, and it was one of the biggest blows to the organization in its history. The government had finally succeeded in dismantling the Mafia's leadership structure, and it would take years for the organization to recover. The Mafia Commission trial. In the early 1980s, the government arrested and convicted several high-ranking members of the Mafia Commission. This group consisted of the top bosses from 5 of the most powerful crime families in the country. They were arrested on racketeering and drug trafficking charges, and after a lengthy trial, they were convicted. This was another major blow to the Mafia, and it dealt a death knell to the organization. The government had finally succeeded in bringing down the top bosses of the Mafia, and it would take years for the organization to recover. In fact, it's unlikely that the Mafia will ever be the same again. These trials and many others like them have severely weakened the organization, and it's unlikely that it will ever regain its former power. The government's cover-up. One of the most interesting Mafia trials was that of Michael Franzese. However, what if I told you that the U.S. government actually tried to cover up this case? Franzese was a high-ranking member of the Colombo crime family, and he was involved in a wide range of criminal activities. This included gambling, extortion, and narcotics trafficking. However, the government didn't want to arrest Franzese. In fact, they offered him a deal that would make him a multi-millionaire. All they wanted in return was for Franzese to testify against his fellow mobsters. Now, you might be wondering why the government would offer Franzese such a lucrative deal. Well, the answer is simple. The government was desperate. They had been trying to bring down the Mafia for years, and they needed a major victory. They knew that Franzese was the key to doing that. However, they couldn't get Franzese to testify against his fellow mobsters. No matter how much money they offered him, he refused to cooperate. That's when the government hatched a secret plan to force Franzese to testify. They set up a fake meeting between Franzese and a fellow mobster. And then they bugged the room. What happened next was pure genius. The government hoped that Franzese would confess to his crimes during the meeting, and that's exactly what he did. He thought he was talking to a fellow mobster, but it was actually the government. They used Franzese's confession to convict him and several other mobsters. It was one of the biggest victories in the government's war on crime. However, the government tried to keep it a secret. They didn't want people to know that they had bugged the room and used Franzese's confession to convict him. They feared that it would start a media frenzy and cause mobsters across the country to clam up. But the truth always comes out. And eventually, Franzese and other mobsters learned that the government had betrayed them. All right, folks, that's all for now. We hope you enjoyed learning about some of the historic Mafia trials that will change everything. If you did, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Also, check out our other videos about the Mafia. We promise you won't be disappointed.